And what I'd like to do in this talk is, in part, to complicate our understanding of the importance of the Lower East Side in the history of East European Jewish immigrants to America, to complicate it, but also in some ways to corroborate it. Why did that a fusion of Lower East Side and East European Jewish work? Okay, and why do we continue to why is it that we would watch that episode of The Simpsons and know immediately what he meant? Okay, and in the context of this, to tell you something about the Jewish migration to America and the Lower East Side. So I want to complicate and corroborate what is a mythic story. Now, just in terms of the background to the migration, the Jewish migration to the United States from Europe proceeded along the same century of European migration to the United States, a period from the 1820s through the 1920s, in which about 60 million Europeans came to America. Okay. Of those 60 million, about a little bit more than 3 million were Jews. Okay, so there's an actual complete confluence or convergence of the history of European migration to the United States and that of Jews. Both migrations, in other words, the general European and then the Jewish, both of them begin in Western Europe, okay, primarily in the areas that we're going to call Germany. Okay, and I have little quote marks on my fingers here because there's no such country as Germany until 1871. Okay, but there are a variety of independent states and sort of kingdoms which get unified in 1871 and become Germany. So the migrations begin in the West, in Western Europe, and gradually and unevenly spread further and further east through the latter part of the 19th century into the 1920s. So that's true of Jewish migration, it's true of general European migration. Okay, it was also the case that the migration started small. Okay, in other words, the numbers who arrive in the 1820s and 1830s was relatively small compared to the numbers who come in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s. Okay, so it's, one might say it was a movement. This migration to America from Europe was a movement, and I'll use an analogy, or I'll use a phrase which is, I think, kind of clever, but it gathered steam. Okay, over time. And the reason I think that's clever is that it gathered steam for two reasons, okay, or two important technological reasons, which is, for one thing, the intrusion of the railroad, okay, into further and further east into Europe, and therefore it made it possible for people to leave. And just as important was the introduction of steam power for ships, so that when immigrants came on sailing ships in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they could only accommodate relatively small numbers. By the 1870s, steam travel became the norm, and these enormous ships powered by steam could bring hundreds and thousands of immigrants in each load. Okay, I'm sure you've all seen Titanic. Okay, and so you know, the bottom of the Titanic was filled with immigrants coming in a class called steerage. Okay, that couldn't have been done before the 1870s because no ship could have been that large. Okay, so the Jewish migration also went from west to east, although unevenly, and I say unevenly because East European Jews were arriving in the United States long before the Great Migration of the latter part of the 19th century. Okay, so conventionally, we tend to say that from the 1820s to the 1880s, the Jews who came to America were, and again, I put this in quote marks, German, okay, and then after the 1880s, they were quote, Russian, okay, or sometimes be referred to as East European. Now, the problem with that, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the history of the neighborhood, is that there are East European Jews coming to the United States long before the 1880s. Okay, and in fact, if when I teach this, I always give 1870 as the date for the late 1860s as the beginning of the great East European Jewish migration. And notably, Jews came from Germany, okay, in 1900, 1910. So it wasn't as though one ended and the next began, and the two were sort of hermetically sealed categories. Okay, so there was a much more complicated, just actual history of the migration. Now, so this is when the migration takes place. Most popular and even historical renditions of the Jewish migration to the United States like to stress the following. The earlier Jewish immigrants came to make it. Okay, they came because they were sort of adventurous young men eager to make money, and America was the place to do it. Okay, the later immigrants, the East European Jews, came because of persecution. Okay, in fact, many writers who write about the East European Jewish migration don't give the date 1880 as the beginning point, but they actually give a much more specific date, 1881. And now, why 1881? Well, in that year, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And there were a few young Jewish radicals who were involved in the assassination plot. And after the assassination plot, then we see the outbreak of pogroms. Okay, so this is a Russian word for riot. Okay, and these were attacks on Jewish communities, very bloody, murder, destruction of property, rape, tremendous brutality. And in the way in which Jews historically have told their story, they talk about the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe beginning in 1881, sparked by the pogroms. Now, the problem with that, and we could only spend like 1 minute on that, is that first Jews from again, these parts of Bavaria and Baden and Hesse, other parts of what's going to become Germany, also experienced violence against them. But they just weren't called pogroms. Okay, but they were riots against Jews, and they too suffered under economic and personal restrictions, restrictions on their lives because they were Jews. So it wasn't just a group of adventurous young men who said, "Hey, I can do better by coming to America and becoming the Guggenheims or the other great families that emerged out of that migration." Similarly, when we look at the East European Jews, the people who settled in this neighborhood, what's notable is it's very hard analytically, looking at the statistical data, looking at the geographic data, to say that it was the pogroms that sent them to America. Okay, it just doesn't work, and in the questions you may want to ask why that doesn't work, but it's a story that really resonates. But rather, I think the data that we have tells us, and this will be a prelude to life coming to America, life in the Lower East Side, that they came because their way of life, their economic way of life, the way they had made a living, the Jewish economy was absolutely destroyed by economic modernization in Eastern Europe. Okay. Again, it's a very complicated history, and the specific details are not, I think, terribly important, except for the fact that, and this will be a key kind of transition or sort of link, is that in much of Eastern Europe, a large percentage of the Jews, both men and women, made a living in the needle trades. Okay, they were tailors, they were seamstresses, they got jobs in the newly created garment factories that were sprouting up in some of the cities of Eastern Europe. because they had a set of economic skills that were involved in garment making in a way in all stages of the process. Okay, and we're going to see this is the bridge because New York by the 1860s emerged as the center of America's garment trade. Okay, and it was an industry that was largely in the hands of earlier Jewish immigrants. So it was an industry in which Jews owned the factories, and here's this, and there's also a tremendous demand for the first time for ready-made clothing. Okay, and I will, actually, this is, I think, totally fine reason to talk about ready-made clothing and why in the 1870s, 1860s, we begin to see a demand for this. Okay, so we have to put ourselves back in time. The sewing machine is invented in the late 1850s. The Civil War was a fabulous moment for the garment industry because of the first time there were millions of men who needed to be measured and suited for uniforms. And they could compute that a man who was 6'2" and weighed, I don't know, let's say 190 pounds, required so much fabric. Okay, and this is where we get sizes. Okay, for the first time, there is this ability to create these statistics. Okay, so garment industry sort of begins to churn up at the same time as Americans were moving to cities and as European immigrants were coming in. Fewer and fewer women sewed their own clothing or sewed clothing for their families. Okay. Same time, large numbers of young American women were beginning to go out to work, okay, in offices, in stores, in factories, and they needed something to wear. They also began to have a little bit of disposable income, which they decided, not surprising, to spend on clothes. Okay, in addition, sanitary standards began to change. It used to be in the middle of the 19th century and earlier, and certainly before, that a man would wear a shirt for many weeks, and all he would change were the cuffs and the collar. They'd have removable cuffs, removable collars, to wear the same shirt week after week. Okay, now the standards of what was sanitary began to get ratcheted up. I can't comment on if that was sanitary or not, but it became to be unacceptable for a man to wear the same shirt every day and for a woman to wear the same dress over and over and over again. So the garment industry in the United States begins to take off, and by the 1880s, American-made clothing is worn, and what I'm going to say New York-made clothing is worn all over America and indeed all over the world. So the garment industry becomes a hot spot in the American economy. Okay, and here is a population that is having access to the railroads and access to steam travel, and the conditions of their lives were deteriorating in Eastern Europe. And there's, on the other side of the ocean, a demand for people who can work in that industry. Okay, so the migration is very much spurred by economic activity or economic concerns. Okay, and I don't want to underplay the issue of the poor status of Jews in Russia. Remember that there were laws which restricted Jews to living in certain places, an area called the Pale of Settlement. Okay, there were laws on which how they could make a living and how they could not, and there were certain jobs were restricted. They had little access to going to the big cities to have exposure to, and to go for young people to go to college or to go to university to get an education for the modern world. So there are many forces that were working against the Jews, and certainly those pogroms played a part, the violence, but not as the determinative factor. Okay, so let's get our immigrants to New York. Okay, and then we're going to get them to the Lower East Side. Okay, one of the characteristics that made the Jewish migration to the United States after the 1870s, distinctive both in terms of the earlier Jewish migration and in a way distinctive vis-a-vis all the other European immigrants who came to the United States, was the almost single-minded sort of focus on New York. Okay, so we have, this is, by the way, the time, there are large numbers of immigrants coming from Italy, from non-Jews, from Poland, from Lithuania, from Hungary, from all of, again, Central and Eastern Europe. They're all migrating to the United States. Okay, but what's notable is that they were much more likely to spread out and to go to form large enclaves all over the country. And for none of those groups, and let's throw in the Irish, who primarily came in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, for them, while New York was an important place, obviously we know the Irish play an important role in New York's history, and the Italians play an important role in New York's history, and there are Polish communities, there are Greek communities, but for none of those groups did New York become the single most important place. By 1900, 75% of all American Jews lived in New York. Okay, now you can't say that about any other group. Okay, there were large Jewish communities in Chicago, in Baltimore, in Cleveland, in Boston, and the other big industrial cities, but New York was the giant. Okay, and it's a very interesting kind of fusion of the imagery of New York and the condition of the Jews, in that New York emerged as America's biggest city. Right? By the end of the, even early, before the Civil War, New York was the kind of mammoth, colossal city. It only became more so over time. Okay, and Chicago was chugging up to, by the end of the 19th century, to catch up, and they always referred to themselves as the second city. Okay, and they didn't have to say, by the way, what was the first city. We all knew what that was. Okay, and for Jews, it was the same pattern: New York over everything else. Okay, New York became the Jewish capital of America, and it in fact emerges by 1900 as the single largest Jewish city in the world. Okay, no place, not Warsaw, not Łódź, not Białystok, not any of those places in Europe, in Eastern Europe, came close to being the kind of, both in terms of actual numbers and proportion. Okay, in fact, there's an article written at the turn of the century called "The Greatest Jewish City in the World." Okay, that's a description of New York. Now, the reason for this single-minded focus on New York was very much the existence of the garment industry. Okay, for example, large numbers of Polish immigrants who came to the United States went to work in steel mills. So for them, Pittsburgh, okay, Chicago, okay, Buffalo were just as good as New York. Okay, for Jews, for Jewish immigrants bound for the garment industry, those places had little garment industries. New York had the largest number of them all. And later on in my talk, when I want to share with you something about the work lives of the Jews who lived in this neighborhood, I'm going to say something about the nature of the garment industry and how it changed. So the Jewish migration was kind of almost like a magnet drawn to New York. New York became the place to be. Okay, and within New York, this neighborhood, which later, at the time it was not called the Lower East Side, was the area of first settlement. Okay, so that is a newly arriving immigrant from someplace in Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Lithuania, from the Ukraine, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from places like Galicia, disembarks, well, until the construction of Ellis Island, I would disembark at Castle Garden. Okay, and again, I send my students there, and I wouldn't know what to do if I couldn't send them to Ellis Island and to Castle Garden to just get a feel of what this may have felt like. the ease of getting from that point in the on the Battery to this neighborhood was clearly felt. And not only the ease, but they knew that that was the place to go. Okay, we have to remember that migrations go along family chains. Okay, so an uncle living on Rivington Street, okay, will send for a nephew. Okay, the nephew arrives. He's not going to go to Pittsburgh. He's not going to go to Denver. He goes to the uncle on Rivington Street. Okay, and that young man, when he earns enough, will send for his brother. So that brother is not going to go to Denver or to Pittsburgh, but to wherever that young man now seems to be living. So migrations go along family chains. Okay, and we in fact have a word for this. We call this chain migration. And as more and more Jews began to cluster in New York and on in this neighborhood, it only beget more migration to New York and to the neighborhood. So again, one chain, one link pulls the next, which pulls the next. And migration, one commentator actually in Ireland said, migration begets migration. Okay, and again, helps us understand this clustering in a particular area. Okay, now when we want to talk about the Lower East Side and the Jews who lived here, the one question we might want to ask is, first, was it called the Lower East Side at the time? Okay, at the time of the Great Jewish Migration? And the answer actually is not. Okay, that word seems to not emerge until about the 1930s. Okay, and in the places where it was written about, where it's called the Lower East Side in the 1930s, 1940s, sometimes the lower has a, is in lowercase. Sometimes the east is in lowercase. So sometimes one or more of those words is in capital, and since you no doubt spend a great deal of time correcting grammar and spelling for your students, you know, once you put capitals, it becomes something real, okay, and something becomes a proper noun rather than a common noun. But in the period of the Great Migration, this was sometimes called the Jewish Quarter, the Hebrew Quarter, the East Side. Writers at the time would refer to particular areas within the neighborhood. They might talk about Rutgers Square, Delancey Street, Houston Street, Orchard Street, but it's only later on, in fact, as the neighborhood ceased to be what it had been, that it got elevated to being the Lower East Side. So where was it? Well, you know, it depended who you were asking. Okay, for one thing, it's not even clear it was a single neighborhood. How do we know what's a neighborhood? Okay, I think a lot of the neighborhoods we have now are actually real estate designations, right? So I live in a neighborhood called NoHo. Okay, and now you look on a map of New York from 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and you want to find NoHo, well, it's not going to be there because it was real estate, this real estate industry that came up with that term. Within this area, north of Division Street, probably south of Houston Street, west of Christie Street, up to the river, there were areas that were more economically, where the better off lived. So it wasn't all classes jumbled together, and not everybody was destitute and poor. Many of them were, but not everybody. There were areas that attracted particular nationality groups. So for example, Hungarian Jews tended to live closer to Houston Street. Okay, the areas around Rutgers Square, East Broadway tended to be the heart of the Jewish quarter, the Russian quarter, and so on. So it was very differentiated within it. Another thing we might want to say about the Lower East Side to help us understand it is we have to remember it wasn't only Jews who lived here. Okay, so again, when Krusty the Clown said, I was born on the Lower East Side of Springfield, he wasn't referring to the Italians who lived in the neighborhood, or the Irish, or the Polish and other East European Christians who lived here. Okay, but they too were part of this neighborhood. Okay, if you go to the Tenement Museum and you see the apartment of the Baldizzis, this family, the Sicilian family, who lived across the air shaft from the Rogaszewski family. Okay, and they interacted with each other, and the kids remembered playing together. So it wasn't an all-Jewish neighborhood. Secondly, it's important to note that it wasn't, among the Jews, it wasn't just an East European neighborhood. Okay, in other words, it wasn't just Jews from, quote, Russia, or however we want to call this enormous piece of land called Eastern Europe. They weren't the only Jews who lived here. If we move back a little bit in time, we know that this was a neighborhood that Central European Jews, let's call them German for lack of a better term right now, German Jews were living in this neighborhood in the 1830s. And so this was a German Jewish neighborhood as well. It was a Hungarian Jewish neighborhood. Many of the institutions that existed were created by these previous immigrants. I spoke here in the sanctuary a number of years ago for the anniversary of an organization called the B'nai B'rith. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was a Jewish benevolent association, fraternal organization that was one of the largest Jewish organizations in the world. Okay, and it was founded in 1843 by a group of Jewish men from Bavaria on Essex Street. So in some ways, while this building is obviously amazing and phenomenal, if somebody asked, well, what's the most enduring Jewish institution that came out of the Lower East Side, the answer would have to be the B'nai B'rith. Okay, so, but it had nothing to do with East European Jews, and in a way, it kind of gets marginalized in the telling of the Lower East Side story. The Lower East Side also, or this neighborhood, had a significant concentration of Jews from the Ottoman Empire. Okay, there were Jews from Rhodes, there were Jews from Greece, there were Jews from Syria who lived primarily along Allen Street. Okay, and we have some lovely memoirs of Jewish children from Russian Jewish families who would wander over to Allen Street, and they'd go into some of the stores owned by these, what were called Levantine Jews, and they couldn't believe the people were Jewish. He said they don't speak Yiddish, okay, which was the Jewish lingua franca of Europe. They eat weird things like olives and eggplant, okay, and how could they be Jewish? Okay, and so there's a meeting that goes on between Jews from different parts of the world in this neighborhood. Okay, so the neighborhood, again, we're not sure exactly where it was. It was divided within itself. It wasn't just Jewish, and it wasn't just East European. But again, as Krusty the Clown tells us, the neighborhood is associated with that East European Jewish migration. And so that's where I would like to turn, the East European Jews in this neighborhood. Okay, by the way, now would be a perfect time if you want to interrupt. So I think the half hour, Susan, is that? Okay, great. Okay, great. So again, the East European Jews who came to this neighborhood came here very early. There's evidence of their settling in this neighborhood in the 1830s and the 1840s. The first Russian Jewish congregation was founded in 1852. Okay, that means there were enough Jews from who identified themselves with Eastern Europe that they founded their own congregation and didn't want to necessarily worship with those Jews who had come from Hungary or who'd come from various parts of Germany. Okay, so the neighborhood we begin to see East European Jewish life in this neighborhood long before the Civil War. The neighborhood begins as well. The neighborhood began to decline as a Jewish area in terms of density and numbers by 1910. So the 1910 census begins to shows the beginning of a thinning out of the population, okay, of the Jewish population. Okay. Now, until that point, it was not only that New York was the largest Jewish community in the world, but this neighborhood was. Okay. More Jews lived below Houston Street than in all of Warsaw. Okay, so it was really a major sort of concentration. Now, just in terms of why the population began to thin out in the 1910s, is that the children of the immigrants experienced mobility. Okay, they got better jobs, they earned more money, Many of them, or their parents even, worked in garment factories that were unionized, and with unionization it meant better wages, and they could afford to live someplace better, okay, with perhaps an extra room, or maybe something green growing on the street outside. So mobility began to move people out. Okay, and the other, in a way, a kind of technological reason that the neighborhood begins to thin out in the first decade of the 20th century was the building of the Williamsburg Bridge. And so after the bridge opens, most Jewish newcomers went directly to Brooklyn, okay, to neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Brownsville, okay, and would then make the easy trip into the city for work. Okay, so the opening up of what was defined as better housing in Brooklyn moved Jews, directed the new immigrants to what we now call an outer borough, and many Jews who lived here also moved to Brooklyn. Okay, so the neighborhood begins to lose population in the first decade of the 20th century, and as you know, in 1924, Congress enacted very severe immigration restriction, and it meant that basically no new immigrants were coming. Okay, so there weren't Jewish immigrants. I mean, I don't mean that there were no new immigrants. There were new immigrants, but they weren't coming. They weren't Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So no new East European Jewish immigrants were taking the places of those who were moving uptown to Harlem, okay, which was then very much a Jewish neighborhood, to the Bronx or to Brooklyn. Okay, so the neighborhood lost population. Okay, but despite the loss of population, the Lower East Side continued to resonate as a place of Jewish life and clearly became an important place in Jewish historic memory. Whereas Jews remembered the Lower East Side in ways they didn't necessarily remember other neighborhoods. And in some ways, this building and its restoration is a testimony to that. Jews from all over the country contributed money to the restoration of a building, not necessarily in a city that they lived in. And there may have been in the places they lived similar, couldn't be as beautiful, but similar old synagogues, which could have gotten restored too. And there has been. The Breed Street Synagogue in Los Angeles is in the process of getting renovated. There are a few in Washington, D.C. But this was the place that pulled them and pulled their contributions to make this possible. Okay, so New York, the Lower East Side had this great power of shaping Jewish memory. And what I want to look at then, as we move on, is what went on in this neighborhood and how does that maybe help us understand why, beyond numbers and beyond percentages, this neighborhood has had so much impact on Jewish life. Okay, so I want to talk about 5 or 6 categories of life in the neighborhood in, let's say, 1900. Okay, 1910, the kind of high point of Jewish life here. Okay, rather than earlier or later, although I'm sure I'll make some references to period before and after. So I think the most important category to begin with is work, because it was work and the inability to make a living that brought the immigrants to the United States. So let's look at work and the ability to make a living in terms of what they found and did for themselves here. Okay, now the 1905 New York State Census, our best document about this, referred to for this neighborhood, indicated that about 65% of the Jews who lived in this neighborhood made a living in the garment industry. Okay, the other, the 55%, how are my numbers there? No, 45% were involved primarily in small business and petty businesses of one kind or another. So let me say something about the garment industry. Okay, again, I've already told you that it was centered in New York, that it was enormous. By 1920, it was actually New York's biggest industry. Okay, it's something that's very hard for us to imagine because now there's very little left of the old garment industry in New York. Okay, but then it was the center of New York's economic dynamism. Okay, just to do it very quickly, in the earliest years, the immigrants who came to the Lower East Side to work in the garment industry worked in units that we call sweatshops. Or not we, they called sweatshops. Okay, and a sweatshop was an apartment workshop. Okay, so somebody's apartment, somebody has an apartment, and he and she, because wives were just as important as husbands in this, would invite people, usually somebody they knew from their home in Europe, to come in, a couple people, 4, 5, 6 people, to come in every day, bring their own sewing machines, and they would move away the furniture where they might have slept or ate, and set up tables, and everybody sat in this apartment. Think about this as your apartment, and they all sewed. Okay, and there'd be one person who was there pressing the clothes at the end of the process. And come lunchtime, the wife in this family would bring out food for the workers to eat. Okay, the workers were terribly exploited. Okay, they had to, if somebody spilled something on a piece of cloth, they had to pay for it themselves. In other words, if it was ruined, the employer could say, I want you to, you're going to stay later. Not I want you, but you will stay later. Okay, so they had there was no regulation. They were obviously unsafe. They were unhealthful. They crammed many, many people into a tiny little apartment, and that's where they sewed. And from there, there'd be a contractor who would pick up the garments and then take them out to be sold. Okay, by about 1900, which again I want to take as the kind of focus or the heart of depiction of the neighborhood, factories began to develop. Okay, factories were larger units, okay, that were not any person's dwelling place, where workers would come and work and then leave. If you were here last March, you could not miss the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So Triangle was the largest of the garment factories. That was 1911. So at that time it was the largest factory. What's very interesting about Triangle and almost all the garment factories is they were owned by former sweatshop owners, themselves East European Jewish immigrants who had saved enough money to open a factory. Factories in the garment industry were relatively small. Even though Triangle was large, it was large only in the garment industry. It was much smaller than a steel mill. Okay, it was much smaller than Henry Ford's auto plant in Detroit. Okay, so garment factories were relatively small compared to other American industries. And they were also interesting because men and women both worked in these factories, most of them doing the same job. So young Jewish women from this neighborhood were so likely, it was almost like, it would be like the same thing as saying, well, everybody goes to high school. Young women in this neighborhood worked until they got married in a garment shop, okay, either in a sweatshop or then a factory. Okay, that's what they did. When they got married, they ceased working in the factory. But while they were there, they worked as sewing machine operators, as did most of the men. Okay, and I probably don't have to ask you who got the higher wage. Okay, we know who did. I should say that the most prestigious jobs in the garment factory were the cutters, the people who cut the garments. Okay, well, actually, that was the most prestigious, was cutting the garment. And then only men cut garments. Women never did that. Only men were pressers at the end who ironed the garment, again, made it what one does with ironing. Most of the sewing machine operators were women and men, with men getting higher salaries. And this, by the way, and they're again primarily Jewish, although there are Italians who work in this also. What's very notable is that Jewish women in this neighborhood and in the garment industry were extremely active in labor organizing. Okay? And it's a kind of historical riddle, like when most women were quite hesitant to join unions, Jewish women were very active. Okay, and 2 years before the Triangle Fire, in 1909, there was a meeting at Cooper Union in the Great Hall of the entire dressmaking, the workers in the dressmaking, the shirtwaist field, okay, which were dresses, and all the union leadership were men, and they were basically saying, times are bad and we can't strike. Okay, we just have to take it. And a young girl who lived on the lower, excuse me, on the Lower East Side named Clara Lemlich, 16 years old, they say under 5 feet tall with a head of fiery red hair, stood up on her chair and said, I don't care what the men say, I say we go out on strike. Okay, and she now obviously is a much more complicated story than that, but out of this came the uprising of the 20,000. And these were 20,000 young Jewish women who led to the rise of the unions in the garment industry. So the garment industry was at the heart of this neighborhood. Okay, and the people on the street were talking about the strike. I mean, it was their daughters, it was their sons. This was the stuff of life in this neighborhood. Now, the other percent who didn't work in the garment industry worked in small business. Okay, businesses of any kind, paper stores, clothing stores, grocery stores, liquor stores, bakeries, you name it, they sold it. Okay, and it's very interesting, in these stores, women, married women worked. Okay, in many cases, the women were the owners of the stores, or men and women, husband and wife, worked together. Usually the husband would say it was his store, but we know from all the data we have that the wives worked as much. So work lay at the heart of the neighborhood. The garment industry and these tiny little businesses provided enough cushion for the generation of children born in this neighborhood to not go back into the garment shops or into those little businesses. In other words, both the garment industry and the small businesses were an immigrant generation phenomenon, and the young people who were born in this neighborhood or who immigrated very young, who grew up in this neighborhood, who went to school in this neighborhood, didn't go into didn't replicate their parents' jobs. Okay, they had access to education. It's a very interesting convergence that New York City, okay, again, the place where 75% of America's Jews went, was the one city in the United States that had free higher education. Okay, the City College was then free, and we should remember City College was only for boys or only for men, but Hunter is founded in the late 19th century for girls, and again, it was free. And so they took tremendous advantage of those opportunities. Okay, now the fact, so having made that last statement, I want to move to another aspect of life in the neighborhood, which if work comes first, then family comes second. Or maybe you can't think of them as separate. Okay, so first let me say something about the migration and family. Jews were among the few groups who immigrated to the United States in which men and women migrated in equal number. Okay, just about 50-50. Okay, among Italians, men migrated in much higher number than women. It was true among Greeks. It was true among many of the non-Jewish East European immigrants. Okay, those were male migrations, which give us a bit of a sense that the men wanted to eventually go back home. They wanted to earn money in the United States and go back home, but didn't, and eventually sent for their wives. Okay, among Jews, we see a substantial number of single women migrating on their own. Okay, we find full families. Okay, it was, by the way, very common that a married Jewish man from, again, Lithuania or Galicia would come to the United States with his oldest children, sons or daughters, or sons and daughters. They would work in New York in the garment industry for however many years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and with the money saved would bring the rest of the family. Okay, so this was very much a neighborhood in which there was a history of disrupted or segmented families. Okay, there seemed to be a history here also of a degree of discord within families, and perhaps because women had spent so many years alone until they migrated, or maybe because the men had lived here so many years on their own before they were able to bring their wives over. There were any number of stresses and strains. One issue that came up not infrequently, and it definitely was not a majority experience, but it came up not infrequently, which tells us something about that migration in the neighborhood, which was the problem of male marital desertion. Married man would come again on his own, expecting to save money to bring his wife and children over, and sometime between when he arrived and when the family was ready to come, he disappears. Okay, sometimes after the wife and the children arrive, the man just sort of went into thin air. This was a serious enough problem that in the 1890s, an organization called the National Council of Jewish Women, which was founded by Americanized American Jewish women, mostly the descendants of earlier immigrants, created something called the National Desertion Bureau. And its goal was to try to track down these men. Okay, and they wanted to track down the men because the men were not paying child support. And here were, children who had to be supported by the mother. And as we know, women earned relatively little money, and it was a crisis. The National Desertion Bureau eventually, or fairly quickly, got the support of the Jewish Daily Forward. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a second. The newspaper still published. There's an English version and a Yiddish version. It's a weekly now. Then it was a daily, founded in 1897. Okay, huge building on East Broadway. Okay, the building is amazing, and I believe it's now condos. So the Jewish Daily Forward had a daily column called The Gallery of Missing Men. Okay, and wives would send in the picture of their husband, and underneath was a description, so-and-so. I've gotten into trouble when I've given a talk on this, and I've made up a name, and somebody in the audience has that same name. So I'll just say so-and-so. Last had lived on 30 Pitt Street, has not been seen since 1907, is being sought. His child had polio, and we need the money. Okay, so day after day was this gallery of missing men. And it gives us a sense that while on some level there's an image that this was a neighborhood where families really stuck together, and I don't want to say that there weren't such families, it was also a site for discord. Okay, for conflict. Okay, and indeed, if we even go back to the Krusty the Clown story, remember he's expelled. He wants something different than his father wanted for him, and rupture between father and son. Well, we know that the American-born children of the East European Jewish immigrants had access to American education, to American popular culture. They were the products of American streets. They were the product of they went to the movies, okay, the silence. They went to Vaudeville. They went to American popular entertainment. Those young men who came of age in the second decade of the 20th century, go into the military during World War I, okay, and they begin to see a world bigger and different than that of the Lower East Side. Okay, and this too becomes an element in differentiation between the generations. Okay, and then finally, in terms of family, there's certainly the husband-wife issue. And just suffice it to say that the Jewish Daily Forward, which again I mentioned in the column of the Gallery of Missing Men, had a very famous column called the Bintel Brief, or the Bundle of Letters. Okay, some of them, by the way, were fake. I mean, that is that the editor made them up. Okay, but even in making them up, he got it to the pulse of the neighborhood and the pulse of life. The article might say the letter to the editor would go something like this: Dear editor, I'm home all day cooking and cleaning. I always have a meal ready for my husband when he comes back from work and my children when they come home from school. Don't I have the right to go out one evening a week for some kind of leisure activity? My husband says no. He says it's not proper. Okay, now, by the way, there were also editors like, my son wants to play baseball. What is baseball? Okay, and the editor then came back with an answer, and usually he was very, his name was Abraham Kahan, and he had his eyes out towards Americanization, and he would write to this woman and say, there's no reason you shouldn't go and take a class at the Educational Alliance. There's no reason you shouldn't go out with a few friends and to a coffee house and enjoy yourself one evening a week. In America, women are free. Okay, and as for baseball, he said there's nothing wrong with it. It's a good way for your son to learn to become an American. So these letters and other documents of a much more, shall we say, serious nature, like court records and records from Jewish charitable societies and social work agencies, indicate that while a majority of families certainly were able to maintain a balance and an equilibrium in the American Lower East Side context, for a not insignificant number, these new opportunities and life on the Lower East Side opened up an arena for conflict. Let me turn very quickly to the issue, and I'm going to put them together, and it's very perhaps odd, but religion and politics. Okay, now here we are standing in a synagogue. Okay, this was the kind of crown jewel of the Lower East Side religious landscape. Okay, there's a story behind why it was so grand. Okay, but what's notable is that very few people actually belonged to synagogues. Okay. Synagogues were there. People went on the high holidays. They went if they had to observe a memorial for a loved one. But the idea of synagogue membership was a very American concept. Okay, the idea that you paid dues. Okay, these are relatively poor, working class people without a lot of expendable income. Okay, there was always a problem of religious authority in the neighborhood. People came from a fairly traditional way of life in Eastern Europe, although I don't want to overstate how traditional it was, because tradition was breaking down there just as it was in the United States. But they came to the United States where there were tremendous options for people to live not necessarily in a way that was sanctioned by Jewish law. So let me give two examples. Okay, as you probably know, within Judaism, the Sabbath, this Saturday, is a holy day from Friday night till Saturday night. One is not allowed to do any work. One is not allowed to handle money, and men consider themselves obligated to go to the synagogue on Saturday morning, and it is truly a day of rest. You don't write, you don't cut, you don't tear, tremendous restrictions on what you can do. Well, on the Lower East Side, one of the most popular things to do on a Friday night, which is part of the holy day, as well as Saturday afternoon, was to go to the Yiddish theater. Okay, not exactly an activity that would be sanctioned by Jewish law. Okay, on a more somber note or more serious note, many of those factories, including factories owned by Jews, had a 6-day work week. Okay, and if you don't work on Saturday, don't bother coming back on Monday. Okay? For those Jews who had small businesses, particularly businesses that catered to a mixed clientele, okay, Saturday was the American day of shopping. Okay? So what does one do? Does one say, I'm not going to keep my store open on Saturday and I'll just do worse economically? Okay, because I'm going to miss the day where people are going to come to work, go to shop, or will I just sort of compromise with my principles and keep the store open? The factory is open on Saturday. Should the father say to the daughter, don't go to work? Or should she listen to him? So there are many ways in which Sabbath observance became a problem. Okay, a second is the issue of the Jewish dietary laws. Okay, so again, just very quickly, within Judaism, some foods may never be eaten. Any of the forbidden animals, pork is probably the most significant one when we're thinking about it in the American context. Even chicken or beef, which can be kosher if they're not slaughtered properly. If there's no supervision on their slaughtering, they can't be eaten. Okay, one cannot go and buy a McDonald's hamburger. Okay, well, the Lower East Side was a place of, Lower East Side and New York, because remember, people left this neighborhood for recreation. Okay, they went out of the neighborhood to sample what was available in the city. New York and the neighborhood were places where all sorts of forbidden food was available. Okay, I mean, one could go out and buy food from a cart, from a store that was not on the list of acceptable food. And so the question of observance of the dietary laws became a problem. Again, families were torn apart by this, and the rabbis in the congregations and those who were more traditional viewed life here as a constant set of compromises and incursions by America on Jewish tradition. Okay, one very famous rabbi actually in Russia said Jews should never come to America. Stay home. It's better to suffer in Russia than to go to America, because he said in America, even the air you breathe is unclean. The stones on the street are unclean. They're the waft of bacon in the air. Okay, so you can't even breathe the air, and in America, it's impossible to keep tradition alive. Okay, so one part of the neighborhood is traditional, and it works very hard to keep tradition in place. Another part said it's not possible, it's too hard. Okay, and we should say, and I said I was going to combine religion and politics, there is another part of the neighborhood that said those laws don't matter anymore. We are modern people. That was superstition. Let's liberate ourselves. And those people, in large measure, represented an important political segment in the neighborhood, which were the socialists. Okay, so this neighborhood was a hotbed of socialism, okay, and anarchism, and after 1917, communism. Okay, but the socialists were very important down here. The Lower East Side sends socialists to the Assembly, to the State Senate, to the City Council. Eventually, Meyer London, in the second decade of the 20th century, is the congressman from the neighborhood, and he's a member of the Socialist Party of America. So socialism was rife. And as I said, so too anarchism. And what gave the neighborhood, I think, a real feel were the political debates. People yelling, screaming, arguing over socialism versus anarchism, socialism versus tradition, socialism versus voting for the Tammany Hall candidate. So politics mattered a great deal. There were tea houses and coffee shops that only socialists would go to. There were tea houses and coffee shops that only the anarchists frequented. So politics mattered. Again, families were shattered over political arguments. Okay, one can also say, and I want to draw this to a close, that this was a neighborhood in which leisure meant a great deal. Almost all the early silent movie houses in New York were below Houston Street. So where the East European Jewish immigrants lived, and it was true in other big cities as well, is where you see the first movie houses. Okay, and again, many of the people who owned these movie houses were immigrant Jews who saw this as a really excellent new business opportunity. It could be like opening up an internet cafe. You know, it's like the hot new thing, even though that's probably no longer very hot since people have their Wi-Fi. In the neighborhood had a great deal of leisure. There were dance academies, there were dance halls. The various social settlement houses like the Educational Alliance offered classes as an antidote to the dance halls. Okay, there were hundreds and hundreds of organizations, and each one of these organizations, many of them connected to sort of the hometown in Europe, had dinners and banquets and picnics and weekly meetings. So leisure time was something very important, and I think for many of the immigrants who lived here, the idea of having leisure was something that America made possible. That they had the ability to have leisure time and to have that leisure time taken up with commercialized fun activities. Okay, the neighborhood really throbbed with these kinds of political, religious, recreational opportunities. Okay, it was a neighborhood that was seething with people. Okay, it was incredibly dense. Jacob Riis in 1890 described it as more dense, as he says, than either Calcutta or Bombay. Okay, which to him were like the kind of most crowded places in the world. He had no statistical evidence for this, but so it's a place in which crowds and people were on the street, and they were buying. People bought in the street. They were arguing over religion. They were arguing over politics. There was a kind of throbbing quality to life in the neighborhood. Okay, so this neighborhood, which I'm going to actually draw this to a close because I think I probably talked longer than I should have, and we have a few minutes for questions, and you'll let me know. Okay, was a neighborhood that at its height was incredibly notable for the way people lived, and not just in their apartments but on the streets. Okay, and what I think helped make the Lower East Side such a pillar of memory, something that people remembered, was that it was one of the most written about neighborhoods in the United States. Okay, hundreds and hundreds of magazine articles appeared in English language magazines about the curious lives of the Hebrew Quarter. Okay, one reporter came down to write an article, and he ended up with a beautiful little book by his name was Hutchins Hapgood, and it was called The Spirit of the Ghetto. And so he wrote, it was 1909, and he wrote about all the curious types of people he saw on the street. And in the coffee houses and in the synagogues. So this was just a real draw for, we might consider them to be tourists, okay, tourists in the sense of being journalists who want to get local color. The Yiddish stage, which is created, the Yiddish theater, which is created in New York and in this neighborhood. New York reviewers, theater critics for the New York newspapers who didn't understand the word of Yiddish would, however, come to the Yiddish theater to see the plays and to look at the interaction between the audience and the people on the stage. Okay, and there's a very famous anecdote that one of the plays, which is called the Yiddish King Lear, so it takes King Lear and he makes him a rabbi rather than a king, somebody in the audience stands up and yells to Lear, "Forget about those bad daughters, come home with me, my wife will cook you a good meal." It's a great deal of interaction between the audience and the actors. So the neighborhood drew people to come, even if outsiders, to come and look at it. So that American Jews, a reader of a Yiddish newspaper in Denver or Pittsburgh or Los Angeles was reading a newspaper published on East Broadway. Okay, and so this disseminated the idea of New York and of the Lower East Side as the heart of East European Jewry in America. Violence against them, but they just weren't called pogroms. Okay, but they were riots against Jews, and they too suffered under economic and personal restrictions, restrictions on their lives because they were Jews. So it wasn't just a group of adventurous young men who said, hey, I can do better by coming to America and becoming the Guggenheims or the other great families that emerged out of that migration. Similarly, when we look at the East European Jews, the people who settled in this neighborhood, what's notable is it's very hard analytically, looking at the statistical data, looking at the geographic data, to say that it was the pogroms that sent them to America. Okay, it just doesn't work, and in the questions you may want to ask why that doesn't work, but it's a story that really resonates. But rather, I think the data that we have tells us, and this will be a prelude to life coming to America, life in the Lower East Side, that they came because their way of life, their economic way of life, the way they had made a living, the Jewish economy was absolutely destroyed by economic modernization in Eastern Europe. Okay. Again, it's a very complicated history, and the specific details are not, I think, terribly important, except for the fact that, and this will be a key kind of transition or sort of link, is that in much of Eastern Europe, a large percentage of the Jews, both men and women, made a living in the needle trades. Okay, I have little quote marks on my fingers here because there's no such country as Germany until 1871. Okay, but there are a variety of independent states and sort of kingdoms which get unified in 1871 and become Germany. So the migrations begin in the West, in Western Europe, and gradually and unevenly spread further and further east through the latter part of the 19th century into the 1920s. So that's true of Jewish migration, it's true of general European migration. Okay, it was also the case that the migration started small. Okay, in other words, the numbers who arrived in the 1820s and 1830s was relatively small compared to the numbers who come in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s. Okay, so it's, one might say it was a movement. This migration to America from Europe was a movement, and I'll use I'll use a phrase which is, I think, kind of clever, but it gathered steam. Okay, over time. And the reason I think that's clever is that it gathered steam for two reasons, okay, or two important technological reasons, which is, for one thing, the intrusion of the railroad, okay, into further and further east into Europe, and therefore it made it possible for people to leave. And just as important was the introduction of steam power for ships, so that when immigrants came on sailing ships in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they could only accommodate relatively small numbers. By the 1870s, steam travel became the norm, and these enormous ships powered by And what I'd like to do in this talk is, in part, to complicate our understanding of the importance of the Lower East Side in the history of East European Jewish immigrants to America, to complicate it, but also in some ways to corroborate it. Why did that a fusion of Lower East Side and East European Jewish work? Okay, and why do we continue to why is it that we would watch that episode of The Simpsons and know immediately what he meant? Okay, and in the context of this, to tell you something about the Jewish migration to America and the Lower East Side. So I want to complicate and corroborate what is a mythic story. Now, just in terms of the background to the migration, the Jewish migration to the United States from Europe proceeded along the same century of European migration to the United States, a period from the 1820s through the 1920s, in which about 60 million Europeans came to America. Okay. Of those 60 million, a little bit more than 3 million were Jews. Okay, so there's an actual complete confluence or convergence of the history of European migration to the United States and that of Jews. Both migrations, the general European and then the Jewish, both of them begin in Western Europe, okay, primarily in the areas that we're going to call Germany, and even historical renditions of the Jewish migration to the United States like to stress the following. The earlier Jewish immigrants came to make it. Okay, they came because they were sort of adventurous young men eager to make money, and America was the place to do it. Okay, the later immigrants, the East European Jews, came because of persecution. Okay, in fact, many writers who write about the East European Jewish migration don't give the date 1880 as the beginning point, but they actually give a much more specific date, 1881. And now, why 1881? Well, in that year, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And there were a few young Jewish radicals who were involved in the assassination plot. And after the assassination plot, then we see the outbreak of pogroms. Okay, so this is a Russian word for riot. Okay, and these were attacks on Jewish communities, very bloody, murder, destruction of property, rape, tremendous brutality. And in the way in which Jews historically have told their story, they talk about the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe beginning in 1881, sparked by the pogroms. Now, the problem with that, and we could only spend like 1 minute on that, is that first Jews from again, these parts of Bavaria and Baden and Hesse, other parts of what's going to become Germany, also experienced steam, could bring hundreds, thousands of immigrants in each load. Okay, I'm sure you've all seen Titanic. Okay, and so the bottom of the Titanic was filled with immigrants coming in a class called steerage. Okay, that couldn't have been done before the 1870s because no ship could have been that large. Okay, so the Jewish migration also went from west to east, although unevenly, and I say unevenly because East European Jews were arriving in the United States long before the Great Migration of the latter part of the 19th century. Okay, so conventionally, we tend to say that from the 1820s to the 1880s, the Jews who came to America were, and again, I put this in quote marks, German, okay, and then after the 1880s, they were, quote, Russian, okay, or sometimes be referred to as East European. Now, the problem with that, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the history of the neighborhood, is that there are East European Jews coming to the United States long before the 1880s. Okay, and in fact, when I teach this, I always give 1870 as the date for the late 1860s as the beginning of the great East European Jewish migration. And notably, Jews came from Germany, okay, in 1900, 1910. So it wasn't as though one ended and the next began, and the two were sort of hermetically sealed categories. Okay, so there was a much more complicated, just actual history of the migration. Now, so this is when the migration takes place. Most popular